Hello, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to have Chris Jephson with us today for our In Conversation series. Chris Jephson is former director at Maersk. He's been working there for more than 40 years, had an incredible career, and I'm sure you're all going to enjoy listening to what Chris has to say about his journey through Maersk, his journey with his experience with supply chain management and with logistics. So, Chris, I'm so delighted to have you with us here for this In Conversation series that we're doing as part of our Supply Chain Thought Leadership series. Now, we've known each other for some years, Chris, and I've always been very inspired by a lot of the stories that you've shared with me, through your journey, through your time at Maersk, and it's always been very inspiring. Now, what I'd like you to do is, for our listeners and those who are watching us, I just wanted to really hear about, a little bit more about yourself, who is Chris Jephson? And also, your career started, over 40 years ago, and you spent a lot of those years with Maersk, of course, but globally, throughout the world. You're now based in Denmark. But tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you come into supply chain management? How did you join Maersk?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for the opportunity. I think the answer to that question is that I came in by accident. I had been already in the shipping industry since about 1970 and joined Maersk direct in 76. And then had been working in Copenhagen, working in the UK, and in around the end of '89, I was invited to join a small team in Copenhagen. And that team was basically given the task of finding out about supply chain management as a business opportunity. Within a month of starting, we were over in the United States and into a week program with Doug Lambert, Professor Doug Lambert at South Florida University. And really was struck by the fact, I think I probably even used the word shocked, by the fact that what we were moving were containers with bills of lading, but actually what this whole program was talking about were things like purchase orders, purchase order lines, purchase order management systems, inventory and stuff like this, a completely new language and a completely new perspective on the business. Coming back after that program, only about a month or so later, we got an invitation to meet some consultants in Hong Kong, and that led us into a contract about a year or so later that really took us 2 years to actually absorb. I should say that one of our first tasks was to write a business case, and the business case said, look for 2 or 3 small to medium-sized customers to work with to test this concept. And what we ended up with was actually a massive American conglomerate with 15, I think, divisions, 7 of which imported and retailed through about 7,000 stores. So suddenly things like inventory and purchase orders were not just something foreign, these were critical to the success of this project. What was the project about? Well, the project was essentially quite simple. The idea was that every time an importing division placed a purchase order on an external supplier, the idea was they would send us an electronic copy of it. We would receive that into our systems through EDI, and then we would basically use our organization around the world, particularly in Asia, to manage the flow of that purchase order from the factory to the distribution centers in the United States. That was conceptually very simple, but actually what we found was that we would, in any case, dealing with data at a factor of at least 10 greater than the data quality or quantities that we were used to dealing with, because purchase orders are not synonymous with bills of lading. So that was one challenge. A massive challenge, which we succeeded eventually in working to resolve, was technology, because the technology at the time was quite simple. We're talking here about 1990, 1991, 1992. The technology was pretty simple. EDI was basically what was driving the process. But once you've got the data into our system, being able to not just contact the vendor, but also manage the process of moving that purchase order from the factory through the port onto a ship and out at another end, maybe transshipping it somewhere en route to a destination and on carrying it to the distribution center. Again, quite a simple concept, until you realize that purchase orders get cancelled, they get changed quite regularly. And one challenge that we hadn't thought of was the fact that these 7 importing divisions, none of them actually had the same purchase order management system. None of them actually had the same purchase order structure. So we were dealing with not just one system, but actually a complex mass of different systems. It took us about 2 years to get it under control, but under control we did get it. And in fact, to the point where in around 1994, 1995, we started to implement a performance bonus scheme with the client, which worked extremely well. While all this was going on, of course, we were learning. And what we were learning was the complexity of, in particular, the retail industry. We were also trying at the same time to work with other companies, using the learnings as we were going along to then go in and sell to others. And we were becoming quite successful with that. I project managed that for the first 2 years of the project, and then I moved back to Copenhagen, having spent most of that 2 years in hotels and aircraft all over the world. My role after that was very much to work with the organization, having taken all these learnings on board, and support particularly the teams that we were building around the world to generate new business, to acquire new business, and to run new business. In addition to that, we were actually quite keen on growing the business, so we were also looking for acquisitions. And on top of that, one of the roles that I had was responsible for training the organization, because we were growing very fast. In 1991, we were really a small team of 6, given the resources of a small company called Mercantile, which were about 80. So we were about 85, 86 people. By the time we got to 10 years later, we were 11,000. So we had been able to grow that business at the rate of over 1,000 people a year, and a business which was generating turnover well in excess of that. So it was a high growth, extremely challenging and extremely interesting time. One of the things which then I spent a lot of time on later was actually taking some of these learnings and then trying to embed them not only into the logistics business, but actually into Maersk. And if you look at what Maersk is trying to do today with its focus very much on containers and logistics and supply chain, that essentially was where that whole concept, if you like, comes from. My career, well, my plan was to retire in 2012, but in actual fact, in conversation with one of my colleagues, we managed to get the board's approval to write a book, and we successfully analyzed and interviewed about 100 people around the world in the organization, some who had just come in, some who'd been there for years, and some who had already retired, and used that as the ready resources to write a book on Maersk and containers in the first 40 years. So the book is actually Maersk Line in Containers 73 to 2013. The book came out in 2014, 15, and I was given the opportunity to spend a year promoting the book in different places around the world, including at MIT and Cranfield and universities in Asia and other parts of Europe. I think the whole learning process was really quite fascinating, because conceptually supply chain is quite simple, but the more you get into it, the more fascinating it becomes, because the more complex it becomes. And today we're in an environment where we have, if you like, somewhat chaotic supply chains, in the sense that how do you respond to a COVID situation which you've never really seen before? I mean, the last time was in 1918, and there aren't too many people around from that time that one can consult. So trying to figure out how to manage supply chains today, I don't envy too many people involved in that industry, and I'm glad, if you like, that I'm retired and can absorb it from the outside. I think one of the things that we learned in that whole process, which was one of the most complex, one of the most difficult, and that is remembering that this, from our perspective, this was a 4PL operation. We were not the retailer, we were not the supplier, we were in the middle. And we were therefore trying, if you like, our best to manage these processes in the most cost-effective and operationally effective manner possible. One of the biggest challenges, I think, in that particular role is to build and maintain trust. The trust with the suppliers, that you're not going to do something with their goods and their relationship with the buyer, and on the other hand, with all the buyers at the other end in satisfying their extremely demanding requirements. And then actually there's another element to it, and that is that if you're acting as a 4PL, you also have this responsibility to maintain relations and trust with all the suppliers that you're using in the middle. Whether it's aircraft, whether it's ships, whether it's trucks, whether it's customs house brokerage, etc. There's a whole complex of different elements there that you have to find a way of building trust with, because if you don't have that, fundamentally, I don't think you'll be very successful. So that, I think, was one of the biggest learnings from this whole process. How do you actually do that? How do you not just build it, but how do you maintain it as well? On top of that, there are so many other things one could talk about. Resilience today seems to be a product of the last, I don't know, maybe the last 10 years or so. Risk management, another element of maybe related directly to resilience, but a concept which, when we were really starting off in the 90s, we weren't really thinking of at all. Today, important, challenging. On top of that, environmental issues. I remember working with IKEA on a number of projects, and one of the things that impressed me about their approach to the environment was already back in the mid-90s, was really focusing on how do you actually fill trucks as a logistics operation. It's not just a question of moving a truck from A to B, but it's actually moving it full, so that environmentally it minimizes the impact of that move. And so many trucks that you see today, particularly with home deliveries, when you open the doors, they're 90% empty. So a whole host of relatively new aspects to the supply chain industry have probably come onto the table in a very serious way over the last 5 to 10 years. And there's no doubt to my mind that there will be more as we go forward.
Fascinating, Chris. And, you know, in addition to your role at Maersk, you've also held the role of on the advisory board at Cranfield School of Management at their Department for Transport and Logistics.
Absolutely.
Can you tell me a little bit about your role there and how you helped support, you know, the sort of key decisions? Because what role did you play in sort of advising the school on curriculum and so forth? And particularly, like, it's about, and then also about what you think about upskilling, you know, the supply chain professionals of today.
Well, one of the most, I mean, I was very lucky when I came back from this project that I had a role. I guess today you'll probably call it a CCO role, but we didn't have that role at that point. But basically it had three elements to it. One was our customers and supporting the teams working with the customers. Another element of it, because we were really wanting to grow the business quickly, was looking for acquisitions. And the third was really putting in place training programs. The training programs, you could even say, permeated all three of those, but were an outcome in their own right. Having really learned from a little bit from Doug in that first week, it was very clear that as we built the business, we had to upskill. Most of the people that we were bringing into the business were coming from shipping, whether they were from Maersk or from outside. They were basically people in shipping. And to them, as to us earlier, things like purchase orders and stuff like this were completely new. So upskilling was a critical element, and that actually led me very early on to establish contact with Cranfield. First of all, because they were in the UK and we were in Denmark, and that was relatively close, but also because Cranfield had an approach to training and education and working with companies, which I think was nearly unique at the time, but it was an extremely close partnership. And that partnership with Martin and his team developed and continued for many, many years.
With Martin Christopher, that is.
Martin Christopher, yeah. As we expanded and as we developed, so we realized we actually had to also run these programs, not just in Europe, but also in Asia and in the United States. And that led us back to Doug Lambert. So with Martin and Doug Lambert together, we ran programs pretty well all over the world. And towards the end of that whole program, we actually started to work together with CEIBS in Shanghai, the China-Europe, CEIBS, China-Europe International Business School in Shanghai, where both Martin and Doug, I think, also had contacts, and where we worked together with the three partners to actually run these programs. They were highly successful, and many of the people that are actually in supply chain management, not just in Maersk, but all over the world today, actually got their initial training in those programs. And it's really one of my delights, if you like, is to see them on Facebook and LinkedIn and other parts of the world where they still remember some of those training programs. So that really was one of the most fascinating elements of it, and continued for many, many years afterwards. Also because as we expanded, we brought more and more people from Maersk Line into training, so that they, as Maersk people, as opposed to logistics people, actually had an understanding of what was going on that side of the business.
It's fascinating, Chris. And you could almost say that training has never been more important than it is today. We're living in a very radically different world, and one of the things I guess that COVID has contributed to is this understanding that training can be delivered quite successfully online and remotely, hopefully also encouraging that knowledge is accessible for all. Now, you mentioned earlier that in the early days of Maersk, risk management and resilience, these were not kind of sort of areas that one needed to consider or think about so much. But today we could say that we could argue that it's supply chain risk management as opposed to just supply chain management that one needs to be considering. And it's this, we've got to be prepared and anticipate the uncertainties ahead of demand more than ever. So, from all your experiences of being at Maersk, the global experiences you've had, and also as an advisor at one of the most successful logistics and supply chain departments in Europe, what advice would you give, to tomorrow's supply chain professionals and the challenges that lay ahead? I know that's a big, huge question.
I'm not sure where would you even start with that advice. Well, I think one of the places that I would definitely, I spent, I think, something like 10, maybe 12 or 13 years on Martin Christopher's advisory board. And I think one of the fascinating things about that was that advisory board was about, I think, 15 to 20 people, most meetings. And they were from very, very different walks of life. Some suppliers, some producers, some 4PLs, etc. There was a great range. So I think one of the things that I would really advise anybody starting off in the industry is learn from the best. There is an enormous amount to learn. There's no question about that. It doesn't matter what part of the supply chain one is in, or whether one is looking at a complete supply chain. The implications of that supply chain on a successful business. I think one of Martin's, now I need to search back now in my memory, I'm not sure I get it right, but basically that supply chain, that companies don't compete, supply chains compete. And I think that's a very profound observation. So how do we figure out how to make supply chains function effectively in an environment where tomorrow could look extremely different from today? What sort of things do we need to put in place? I mean, one of the things that is fundamentally different, I think, today compared to when I was starting in this industry in the 90s, and that is that today technology is infinitely better. And secondly, the capability of networks using technology is also infinitely better. So the question then is, how do I actually get that whole platform and network to function effectively and resiliently? And that's the whole game. The Queen's Gambit, I think, has been a populist program recently, and that's absolutely what the game is all about.
Yeah. It's been fascinating to talk to you, Chris, and I think that is a very good point to, I think, end or close our conversation with you. So, Chris Jephson, it's been fascinating to be in conversation with you. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for sharing your journey with you. And you're absolutely right. You know, we don't know what tomorrow will bring. And I think that's what makes supply chains ever more fascinating. They're so dynamic. But one thing is for sure, that change is certainly on the horizon, and making sure that we have the appropriate training programs and that are also dynamic and constantly evolving to meet the future needs of challenges and so on are only going to increase in importance.
Agree.
Thank you, Chris Jephson. Thank you.
Pleasure.